This UCSD TV program is a presentation of University of California Television for educational and non-commercial use only.
Roger, you stole my first question. That is, I was going to ask the entire group, did you have any idea that you were going to be selected that year for the Nobel Prize? And what was it like to actually get the call? So, Harry?
Jim Tobin had gotten a call maybe 6 or 7 years before me, and was announced that he had gotten it for portfolio theory. So I thought, no, I was never going to get it for portfolio theory. Actually, Jim called me and said he didn't get it for portfolio theory, he got it for miscellaneous good works, macroeconomics. A couple of years before Jim, there was a prize given for essentially linear programming, and George Dantzig didn't get it. So it was an absolute scandal that George didn't get it. So I figured, no, I'll never get it. So it was indeed a surprise when we got a call and did get it.
So what was it like to get that call?
Well, we were in Japan, and they didn't know how to reach us. So we never did get a call from Nobel. I got a call. I was teaching portfolio theory at Tokyo University, math department. The head of the math department called and said, you just got the Nobel Prize in economics, and would you call this guy at the public television station? He'd like to interview you. So this guy, the guy that was the head of the math department, was not a kidder. We didn't think he was going to pull a joke on us, but we still wanted to hear it ourselves. So at the top of the hour, there was an English language armed forces station, and they'd have the news at the top of the hour. And we heard, that Markowitz, Sharp, and Miller got the prize. And so we called this guy, and he said, I'd like to do an interview. And I said, well, I got some time tomorrow at 3 p.m. He said, no, we want to be on the 9 o'clock news. And so he came out, and we were indeed on the 9 o'clock news. We kept getting calls. Pretty soon, when it was bedtime, I just took the phone out of the, the little socket.
Mario, how about you?
Well, for me, it was indeed a surprise. Some friends had mentioned, you might get the prize, but I never really took it seriously. And the reason is that there were really no precedents for Nobel Prize related to environmental issues. So I really wasn't expecting it. So in fact, I did get a call. Remember, I was in my office already, because it was on East Coast, so I didn't have to answer at 2 in the morning or so. That was lucky. But I sort of didn't quite believe it. But fortunately, I have a good friend also at the Royal Academy of Sciences in Stockholm. So he was on the call, and then I thought, oh, this is indeed for real. Otherwise, I would have doubted it. So that's the way it worked. Yeah.
And how about you, Rob?
Well, we were in France on sabbatical when it happened, and I had absolutely no inkling that it would happen. We'd only noticed on the French news that they had given the physics prize, and it must be Nobel week. But we were curious because actually we thought that Clive would have a good chance of getting the Nobel Prize, but didn't expect that we would be part of this at all. So the phone call came in the middle of the afternoon because, of course, we're in the same time zone, but I was out. So Marianne took the call, and then she said, they wanted to know, did I have my mobile, and how could they reach me, and all that sort of, but they did find us in France. And she said, well, no, he doesn't have his phone with him, but he'll be back in a little bit. So then she asked, so who's calling? And said, this is an important call from Stockholm. And when I arrived home, I thought someone had died. I mean, she was white as a sheet. That I was so afraid you wouldn't get back here. And so afterwards I said, what were you afraid of? That they were going to go to the next person on the list? But anyway, the committee called and had a nice conversation on the French telecom, which was very, I can tell you, what? And there's some calls you don't really like to say, could you say that again, please? But eventually I got the message. And so they told us, of course, the famous phrase, in 5 minutes we're going to tell the press and your life will never be the same again. Goodbye, click. Which is true.
Yeah. So that was actually going to be my next question, is how has it affected you in terms of your life? I mean, this is an example of how you're being dragged away from what you're supposed to be doing. And I'm sure that there are multiple requests for you to do one thing or another. So how has this affected your research career? I'm sure it's really built up your speaking career, but is it totally distracting so you can't get anything done, or do you learn to live with it and just keep plowing ahead? So Roger, you sort of answered that question in part in your presentation, but you're still grinding away in the lab, right? Making pretty colors.
Well, I'm trying to help other people in the lab grind away. I mean, the only time I actually seriously do experiments is between Christmas and New Year's, when people do not expect you to answer emails promptly. And the lab is quiet because some people have gone home, so I can squat on their benches. But yeah, it's been a mixture of, well, Wendy would say an incredible amount of travel that is completely unjustified. Occasionally she comes along and admits that a few of them are a little bit fun, a very small fraction. And yeah, if anything, a few things get easier. You get incredible numbers of invitations to irrelevant conferences and events like International Congress on Soybean Productivity. Why do they want me as a keynote speaker? On the other hand, actually some things get worse, and I actually think that referees are actually more eager to prove that they are completely uninfluenced by anything, and so my success rate has gone down. Now, of course, that may mean that I'm getting senile and my work is getting worse. I think not, but of course, that's me.
I think you just turn down these conferences. It's up, I still turn out as much research as I ever did. Of course, it's been a couple of decades. Jim Tobin, we saw, after it was announced that we were going to get the prize, it turned out Tobin was in the Japan also. So he told us there'd be a couple of years when you'd get, a lot of flood. With us, the drumbeat continues. This is not because of Nobel. It's because there's just a lot of people who are making their living from applications of portfolio theory, not on a day-to-day basis, but on the, portfolio as a whole and so on. And I always say the Nobel Prize was not my greatest honor. My greatest honor came in the men's room of a hotel in Washington, D.C. After the three of us got the prize, the American Finance Association wanted to have the three of us there, so they flew me from Japan to Washington, D.C., and we each spoke, and after, we had a dinner and each of us spoke, and then in the men's room, the guy next to me at the urinal said, Dr. Markowitz, I want to thank you for creating a field in which we all make our living. And every now and then when I give talks, every now and then somebody will get up in the back and say, Dr. Markowitz, thank you, and so on and so forth. And then when that is said, sometimes I get a standing ovation. So that's, just like Katharine Hepburn. So I think it's the Nobel shadow is like Tobin said, 2, 3 years, 4 years, I don't know. And then that should diminish unless you're a sucker for going to these things. And then it's your fluorescent work that continues to make you demanded.
Mario, how about you?
Well, no, it certainly makes a big change, but I saw it initially, of course, it was a change in terms of my productivity, doing the same type of research I was doing, so, but it's a choice you have. At some point, fairly shortly after the prize, I really saw it as an opportunity and even as a responsibility, okay, in the following sense that you have some sort of convening power. Of course, people listen to you. You have to be careful because the temptation is that you suddenly become an expert on everything in general. Okay? So that's certainly not the case. But we do have an opportunity, in our case, as scientists say, to make a case for better science education, and so on and so forth. And in my case, with environmental issues also, I moved a bit into sort of science policy issues, which is something that is also required of scientists to be able to communicate with the public and so on. And in some sense, I felt it was all right. I was lucky. I do have a number of very good students that are professors at universities and are doing great research, okay? So that goes on. I don't have to add to that very much, so I'd rather do it in this other mode where I can probably have a larger positive impact.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you said is what I feel as well, that the opportunities are there, and yet as an econometrician, I'd never, ever given a talk that didn't have equations in it. And yet I would get invited to give talks and say, no equations, please. And I say, well, I can't say anything without an equation. So, and the press, of course, thought you were an expert on everything but didn't want a single equation. So my response to that was kind of, I think, what you said as well, which is to say, okay, now, what is it that I can do that's interesting to people and that actually would advance knowledge? So actually, to some extent, I changed my research agenda to be some more policy relevant and sort of broader implication. And to me, that's been very exciting. I mean, this whole financial crisis has actually provided an opportunity to explore different dimensions of this thing, and so it's changed my research direction, but I think in a very good way.
All of you have served at a number of first-class universities. What advice would you give to UCSD leadership about what we should do to preserve an environment that fosters the creativity that potentially could lead to Nobel prizes? Not necessarily the prize, but to preserve that creative environment that presumably helped you guys get to where you are. And in light of the budget challenges we face, what should our priorities be? Anybody have any suggestions there?
I haven't really been at universities that much. I was at Baruch College for 9 or 10 years, but some of these universities were, when I was teaching at IBM, I'd go down to Wharton one day a week. And when I was, when I was not teaching at IBM, when I was at IBM T.J. Watson Research Center, I would go down to Wharton once a week, or before that I was doing the Rutgers and so on. The thing, I spent roughly a decade or so at RAND. You totaled it up 12 years, and I was at IBM Research. And the wonderful thing about these research labs, and I don't know if you could reproduce that on a campus, was that RAND was one facility where you could walk at a reason, you know, from one end to the other fairly fast and traverse many disciplines, and there would be meetings, conferences in the big meeting room, and all sorts of disciplines could show up, and there would be projects which were interdisciplinary. IBM Research was very much like that, and the problem with a campus is it's so spread out. You don't very often. Today is an exception. You don't often have a chemists and economists and so on all meeting together. So it's just a challenge to a university, given that it's how spread out it is, how to promote this interdisciplinary interaction, cross-fertilization.
Mario?
Well, it's perhaps some general thoughts in terms of sort of trying to enhance creativity, productivity, and so on. Probably the best advice is if you find the right people, to give them as much freedom as you can. Unfortunately, at least in the scientific world, things seem to have been moving. This is not something at UCSD, but more, say, NSF or in general, the scientific enterprise, of being more and more demanding of justifying details of your research. So this sort of ties your hands more. So if you pick the right people and give them resources and let them be creative, of course it's a bit of a gamble, but then that's what really generates things. In terms of interdisciplinary stuff, that's also quite interesting. If you promote teaching or working with students to actually deal with real life problems, so that the idea is you can train them, of course, to be excellent in any one specialty. That needs to be there, but at the same time, to learn to work with other disciplines. So this is something I did manage to do with some colleagues at some point in time, dealing with, for example, with air pollution in megacities and so on, but then not just looking at the chemistry components, but the physics, economics, social, political issues, okay? And students actually loved that, okay? They were doing their own thing, but they were very interested in communicating with students, and it's particularly challenging if you are in the sciences to do it across the social sciences and so. So this is just sort of broadening your perspective to the extent that it's possible, and universities sort of facilitating this type of interactions rather than just having each department as a silo separated from the others.
Rob?
I think one of the challenges is that resources make everything easier. And so if you have an idea that you want to develop, and then you've got to go beat the bushes up and down and through the administration and so forth to get resources for it, it kind of stifles it. So in a time of limited resources, what's the implication of that? It seems to me maybe the university shouldn't be as wide and it should be deeper. Maybe there would be centers of excellence within a department or within an area which would be able to have more resources, but you wouldn't be able to cover as many topics and as wide a range of items. And I think you might find that this excellence would attract more grant money and so forth, and that's a way to grow and maintain the top without losing as much on the sides.
Roger?
Well, in a time of limited resources, one of which, of course, is not just money. The UCSD is gradually running out of space. And when I came here, one of the nice things was so much empty space. There was not a single parking structure. And I said, any university doesn't have a single parking structure. It's got endless lots of room, so it seemed, coming from a place like Berkeley, where you're completely constrained by the surrounding city, and the only way to go is up or by tearing something else down. And sort of that's the automatic price of success at UCSD, is you can't expand forever. But the other issue that's perhaps I think is a relatively cheap way to get creativity is interdisciplinary collaboration and cross-fertilization. And that's easy to say, everybody says it. And the crunch comes when you listen at faculty meetings or to listen to senior administrators, as I've heard at UCSD say, we're not going to throw our FTEs over the fence, which means we're not going to share it with somebody else. We think we're going to get the losing end of this bargain. No, we're going to hold it on to it ourselves. And I have heard it right here by very powerful people here. And that's what scares me.
Well, maybe on that very positive note, we should call the evening to an end. Let me just say,
Wonderful.
Unless each of you has questions for each other, do you? What would you ask Mario, Roger?
What would be?
What I ask? Well, I want to know about the ozone is this great success story, but we've got a much, I guess, bigger problem we're facing today. And I'm just delighted that the price of gasoline is back up to $4 again, but I don't see why we don't actually institutionalize that, force the price of carbon to be high so that we can internalize some of these externalities. And then people say, well, the scientific evidence isn't really there. And
Okay, but
The answer is politics.
that's right. But here is an answer which somehow or other connects to your vocabulary. Okay, and here is it. In the case of the science of the ozone layer, we were able to really establish it quite clearly. Of course, you're never absolutely sure. But in the case of climate change, in a nutshell, much of it is really very fundamental science, freshman level, okay? So that's what is missing, say, in Congress. It's more like astrology, so it's not science. So a lot of it is really very fundamental. But there are some uncertainties at the high end. But that's where you consider risk, okay? You just evaluate it, and you don't have to be absolutely certain to make important decisions. And in this case, that's why we work closely with a number of economists, Paul Krugman's one of them, and so on. And namely, how much to evaluate the risk, how much does it cost to change, and so on. And the consensus among at least many of my economist friends is that it's really not that expensive if you do it right. So it's not worth the risk to continue functioning as we're doing now, because you can appropriately deal with it. You just have to incorporate these externalities. Ideally, there should be a price for emissions and the cost is just a few % of global GDP in the end. So anyhow, risk is a very important word there as well.
But can I ask, I think, isn't there a crucial difference that there were relatively easy technical alternatives to chlorofluorocarbons, and it wasn't that big a piece of economy, and you didn't have to fight entrenched to say DuPont as a big maker of CFCs. They weren't fighting you every step of the way, whereas here in the global warming, there's an enormous number of people who would be at least short-term economic losers, or they think they will be, so they fight it and they doubt the science. And whereas you didn't, you made a convincing case, but I don't think you had to fight the struggle that the climatologists are seeing. Am I wrong there?
No, but just a little bit. In the following sense, DuPont, of course, initially thought, well, unless you have really very strong evidence, why should we change? But DuPont did have a tradition of funding scientific research, so that's how they did. They moved ahead a lot. So at some point, they realize the science is just there. Okay, that's what is not happening with climate change. So DuPont had to make a decision. It's more important for us in terms of public relations or whatever to drop this line of productivity than to continue. And then it turns out that society, industry was very creative. So the replacements were not there initially. They had to look for them, and it worked. So something actually similar, of course, much more complicated, happens with energy. But you can do all sorts of things. Energy efficiency, something that's already on the table. And well, it's a long issue, but there are alternatives already there. Of course, some people will lose, but if you do it sufficiently slowly, and they are sufficiently creative, some of the oil industries, they can actually do pretty well, just like DuPont did it on that case. So if you look at the details, it should be possible. It just turned out to be a very political issue, and unfortunately, here in the United States, it became almost a religious issue. My worry is it's really anti-science.
Yeah.
It's not acceptable that you have this sort of scientific standard in Congress that is equivalent to astrology. Okay, should not be acceptable.
What's your feeling about going nuclear as distinguished from wind and whatever? Solar?
Nuclear is certainly one of the options.
Okay.
Of course, it's not perfect, but the disadvantages have essentially been worked out in terms of safety. Okay, it's no longer a big risk to do it. Storing the nuclear waste is a problem, but it's a relatively small amount. It can be done. The main remaining problem is proliferation, and that again is not really a technical issue, but it's a fact that if you go nuclear throughout the developing world, there would be a risk, like it's happening in Iran, to use that to develop the sort of nuclear weapons. But if society does it right, if there's enough control, you could in principle deal with that. And that's one of the solutions. There's no magic bullet, okay? You have to do a number of things together, but nuclear is certainly one important option, solar is another, and so on. So we can certainly start for the next few decades with existing technology. Of course, the hope is that you would find even better technologies, as has been the case historically.
Maybe one final question for Harry and Rob. Are we on the right direction in terms of financial regulatory reform?
Well, I actually am fairly optimistic that the Dodd-Frank bill will really reduce the risk of a future financial meltdown. That the rules are yet to be fully specified, and we'll have to see how many exceptions are actually allowed. But basically, I think the focus is a big improvement over what we've had before, and hopefully sufficient.
I have a reading. I don't know how many people have read this. It's called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And it has to do with the basic cycle of the capitalist system of you have a time of peace and prosperity, and people get enthusiastic, and they find all sorts of ways of finding not very safe ways of investing their money, and the thing goes through the South Sea bubble. Sir Isaac Newton decided it was a bubble, so he took his money out. But the bubble continued, so he put his money back in, and he got slammed like the rest. So yes, I think the old problems are solved. Give it a decade, and we'll have some new problems.
Well, on that optimistic note, let me thank you.